I'd like to shift gears now and cover a bit of the evolution of the language and I guess the challenges it's faced in the history of the islands. And I guess just logically, at some point, this would have been the primary language of the island, and now we know that that's not the case. So perhaps we could spend a little time on how that came about. I guess the most dramatic event would have been the beginning of the English settlements here and the gradual encroachment of English to the point of forcing the language almost to the extremities of the island. And perhaps you could just say a few words about that period.
Okay, well, insofar as we can tell about the very, very early period, and we're talking here about, say, 4th, 5th century Ireland, where we don't have any historical documents to back up what we know about the country, except things like, for instance, the Confession of St. Patrick, or small documents like that give us some inkling as to what was happening here. Mm-hmm. But we obviously know that the language of the people was what's now called by scholars as primitive Irish or early Irish. Mm-hmm. And we know that for a fact because of the work done in the 19th century and 20th century by German scholars who were linguists and who discovered manuscripts in places like Bobbio or St. Gall or Würzburg, and they discovered what are now called the glosses. Mm-hmm. And these were very often tracts, commentaries on the scriptures or the Psalms or the Pauline epistles, and the monks would have been reading through them in the Latin mm-hmm. language and encountering words that they didn't understand, and much like we do nowadays when we learn a language and we're given a homework task and we look the dictionary up and you write the English word above the German word or the French word or whatever. So they were writing in these old Irish language words, but because they wrote adig over nox, because people knew that nox was the word for night in Latin. Mm-hmm. They therefore figured out that this adig had to mean night, and so that's how scholars were able to construct what the early Irish language might have looked like. Mm-hmm. But the Irish language has also rubbed shoulders culturally with other linguistic influences over its lifetime. Mm-hmm. So for instance, the first big influence on the Irish language is Christianity, because prior to the advent of Christianity we had, Druidism, maybe people would call that paganism, but that was the belief culture, the belief structure, or the belief system of the island, which was, as we've said earlier, an oral structure entirely, an oral tradition. So then this Latin language arrives, which is the language of the church, and because it's also the language of literacy and particularly church terminology, things like altar and benediction and even priest and things like this, we didn't have those words in the Irish language. So those words were all borrowed into the Irish language out of Latin. So sacerdos, or I suppose sacerdos is an ecclesiastical pronunciation of Latin, and sacerdos maybe in classical Latin, that gives rise to a version called sacert, which then in the current language is known as sagert. Mm-hmm. That derives directly from the Latin word for a priest. Mm-hmm. Even the word for a church, the aguas, derives from ecclesia, which is in church in Latin obviously derives, borrowing itself from Greek. So there are all those kind of terminologies. So the next big cultural sort of collision that happened was the arrival of the Vikings in 8th and 9th centuries, and they brought a lot of terminology with them that has to do with seafaring and boats and that kind of thing. So we borrowed quite a bit from them. And then the next major group that interacts with Ireland is the 11th, 12th century, the arrival of the Anglo-Normans. And so we get some French words coming into the language. For example, one of the words that's used in the Irish language for a boy, let's say, is garçon. You don't need to be any great linguistic scholar to figure out that garçon and garçon are closely related. And for example, the Irish language word for where we're sitting at the moment, a room, is seomra, S-E-O-M-R-A. Well, that's so close as to be from here to the door, away from chambre. So we had all these things, all these groups interacted with Irish and did the language no harm. The language just benefited from the cultural interaction with those traditions, but both in terms of language and aspects of cultural development. Even the first main contacts we had with English didn't do the language any harm. What are referred to as the Old English, who arrived in probably 12th, 13th centuries, 14th centuries. They arrived over, a lot of it was to do with the trading links between Wales and England particularly, and Ireland. And those people came in here, some of them settled here, settled amongst the native Irish, and assumed the language and customs and styles of the native Irish, so much so that there's a famous expression in Latin which translates as that they became more Irish than the Irish themselves. But you mentioned, when you were asking me the question about this particular segment of the interview, how did it suddenly happen that Irish became under such a threat? The real challenge came with the high-powered colonial moves of England in the 16th century. Because by that time, the English king and the English government wanted to colonise Ireland. They reckoned that the Irish were a barbaric race of people. They had very rough styles of living and dress and means of behaving, and they decided the English came basically to civilise the Irish.
And they had those guttural tones,
and they had those guttural tones, and they had all these other sort of less than polite ways of behaving. And I suppose we're simplifying things a little bit here, but it's not really that far from the truth. That they decided that, well, that the English society was polite and civil society. They were world leaders in literature and in terms of seafaring and all kinds of things. They were leading the way. So they were coming here to bring civilization to the Irish. So they brought a new legal code. They brought a new language. They were bringing a new faith. And all of these things were counterproductive. Not the English things, but what was already here was counterproductive to the drive to civilize the island. And so I think two things happened. First of all, they enacted these plantations with such force and such brutality in some cases, where the Irish were driven off the good lands, which were seized by the English and then given to colonized settlers. The Irish were forced into those areas, as you said earlier on, the extremities of the island, where the land was poorer. And over a period of time then, a second sea change, I think, began to happen among the Irish. They saw the arrival of the English, who had fine dress, fine homes, fine manners, as it were. They began to feel that the wealth and status was something to be aspired to. And so to a certain degree, a number of social groupings within Ireland began to ape the English, or want to have some of what they had. It's not unlike in modern day culture, how some of the underdeveloped countries or developing countries of the world looks towards the States and the English culture as being so well developed, so civilized, the Coca-Cola culture as it's sometimes called, or the Microsoft culture. And so they want to be part of that. And that was happening as well. But I think the big body blow that was struck to the Irish language and that particular mode of culture that we had here happened first of all in the early 17th century, with the final defeat of the native aristocracy, of the earls, literally the leaders of what we would call our royal families, our native aristocracy. They were defeated at the Battle of Kinsale in the first 7 to 8 years of the 17th century. And as a result of that, the bardic system, the native system of learning, language, literature, law, lore, collapsed without the support of the native aristocracy, who fled the island and moved to France, Italy, Spain. And that was the first big knockback that the language took. But the language still held up reasonably well until the middle of the 19th century, when the Great Famine happened between the years 1840 to 1845, and the population of the island went from roughly about 8 million or thereabouts to 4 million. And the population of Ireland which were strongest in terms of speaking the language,
Yeah.
were in the poorest areas with the least means of surviving such a disaster. And those who didn't die of hunger and starvation fled the country to the States, to England, but principally to the States and other places, Australia and other lands abroad, to make new lives for themselves. And that decimated not only the population of Ireland, but the native Irish-speaking population. And that's where we find that a number of things happen in the 18th century. Then I think it's really the watershed. That's where it all begins to coin that sort of colloquial expression, to go downhill after that.
Yeah. And presumably that trend continued at least up until the Civil War period and the struggle for independence?
Yes, and again, the language held out best in those extremities. The areas that are still preserved, in which Irish is still preserved as the language of everyday intercourse, the northwest Donegal, the west coast of Mayo and Galway, down into Kerry, Cork and into Waterford. Those areas that are called Gaeltacht areas, or Irish-speaking areas, but they're only small pockets of what was once the whole western seaboard. And you're right, the status of the language significantly weakened towards the end of the 19th century. So much so that in the last quarter of the 19th century, a group of language lovers saw what was happening and said, we've got to address this, we've got to try and stem the flow, otherwise the language will disappear and we'll never get it back. And so that you see the beginning of the Fiochan na Gaeilge, or the Irish language renaissance or revival, begins to happen at that point. And that brings you then into the period where the Easter Risings happen, the Civil Wars happen, and English are driven out. The 26 counties of what is now the Republic of Ireland are formed, and the new native government sets out as one of its primary goals the resurrection of the Irish language.
Do we know even roughly what the breakdown might have been at that point in time in terms of people who had Irish as their mother tongue versus English? Do we have any idea of what?
I'm not quite sure exactly of the statistics. I recall reading over the last couple of days that at around that time about 25 to 30%, 25% maybe of the population were monoglot Irish speakers. But they would have mostly be living along these as you call these extremities, the western, southern and northwestern seaboards.
And then post-independence, what were some of the efforts that the new government made to resurrect, as you say, the language?
Well, it happened on a number of fronts. The primary mode of passing on the language or preserving or promoting the language was through the system of education. Because under the education system which the British had here, it was forbidden to learn Irish. They wanted to eradicate the Irish language because they wanted the people to learn and speak English. And then the Irish in the beginning of the Irish Free State, which has happened after independence, they introduced Irish as a compulsory element of the curriculum in schools, and they wanted people to sort of be taught the language. Those people who had no chance previously to learn the language, they wanted the language to be taught. So the thing was driven primarily through the education system. Then certain inducements were introduced to make it more attractive to have Irish. For instance, to become a teacher you needed to have Irish. To get into the civil service you needed good Irish. It was seen to be a stepping stone to promotion at quite a number of civil levels in life.
To become a lawyer.
And become a lawyer, that kind of thing, yes. And as the state grew in its early youth, and as the founding fathers of the state had a very nationalistic goal, they wanted to sort of eradicate all things English. And there was a certain element among the people where to have anything other than a full-blooded approach to what it meant to be Irish, and that meant embracing all aspects of Gaelic culture, the Gaelic games, the native Gaelic games, the native language, and anything really that was anti-English was good in those early days of the state, because of the colonistic nature of the relationship between Ireland and England prior to that. So that's the way that there were two things happening. There was the promotion of the language through the education system, and this idea of trying to change the mindset of the people, that we were now a nation in our own right, and that we should have a language. We had our own language, that we should do everything we could to promote it, to preserve it, and to encourage people to speak it. And I think the founding fathers, their ultimate goal was the re-Gaelicization of Ireland, which was really never going to happen, because it's one thing to commit a people to get rid of a language, it's another thing entirely to commit people to take on a language. One is easier than the other, I think.
Sure.
And so then as the years went on, Irish became seen more and more politically and socially and culturally as an important facet of national identity and expression of what we have as being native to our own heritage.
You mentioned the role of education. Was it generally the case that the entire curriculum and the teaching was done in the native language, or was it sort of an add-on? You would have a separate course in Irish language.
I think it was part, but it's not possibly true to say that it was an add-on. It was part of the curriculum, the school curriculum, as you were learning maths or English or history or whatever. But I think what happened was that in those areas where it was impractical to teach the curriculum through Irish, these would be the areas outside the Gaeltacht areas, it was seen as something that was very important, even though things were being taught through English, but Irish, the ideal was, and the goal was, that Irish would be taught through the medium of Irish, and that eventually people would upskill. Later on then, as the state developed, the government and the education department saw the value of having schools where everything would be taught through the medium of Irish. And the term used for that is Gaeilge, and that term nowadays means a school, the language of instruction in which is Irish. And that movement, that Gaeilge movement, has become very strong. And in those schools, everything is taught through the medium of Irish. Science, other languages. The only thing that I think is taught through English is English itself. And then other types of schools developed over the period as the fledgling state began to look at more effective ways of promoting the language. For instance, in a regular secondary school, let's say, where the medium of instruction was English, you could have a designated stream. So there would be, let's say, if you had 4 classes in first year, 3 would be taught through the medium of English, but one stream would be identified as this I can't remember it was not a stream, but it was a letter or sort of signifier to denote the group that were learning through Irish. So all these things were tried as a means of promoting the language. And I don't think it's fair to say that it was to stand alone, but it was part of a general package. But the Gaeilge movement and the Gaeltacht schools were all taught through the medium of Irish. And another type of institution, the preparatory colleges, there were 6 or 7 of those dotted throughout the country, and they were mostly in the Gaeltacht areas. And they were designed to prepare people for entry into the teaching profession. And everything was taught through Irish in those. And the idea was that if you produced very fluent people as teachers, that would have a knock-on effect of promoting the language in regular schools, even if somebody from a preparatory college was in a normal Dublin school, let's say, or Kildare school, that the influence of their experience of learning through Irish and being fluent in the language would transfer itself out. Of course, the difficulty with that is if you were going into an area where there was no tradition of Irish and there were no supports, either linguistically outside the school or even internally in the school in terms of curricular support and language learning support, that was not going to be a successful way of approaching the thing.
And in the ensuing decades, the language obviously came under a number of challenges, including continued emigration from the island, the beginning of globalization, and perhaps developments in technology where maybe the language came under additional pressure, or at least influence from outside of Irish. And how did the language stand up, say, from the 20s up into the 80s even?
Well, from the 20s to the 60s there was a shrinkage happening, but it was a slower shrinkage. The biggest challenge that the Gaeltacht areas, for example, as being the repositories, the strongest repositories of the native culture, song, dance, and above all language, were under immense pressure, because Ireland, in its early decades, was a very poor country, generally. But those areas that were on the extremes of society were even more impoverished and even more disadvantaged. And a big part of the problem for the Irish language was that young people could not survive. There was no means of them surviving in their own native areas.
Yeah.
So they had to either at least leave the Gaeltacht in Galway or North Donegal or Cork or Kerry and move to places like Limerick or Dublin, where there wasn't such a strong language environment for starters. And of course then many moved away to England and with the intention of returning, but who never returned, and many moved to America and Australia. And so the lifeblood of the future of the language was slowly draining out of these communities.
Yeah. And
there was also the mental mindset that you were living in this poor part of Ireland, speaking a language that nobody outside that, or very few outside that area, could actually speak, that was going to be of no earthly benefit to you at all in making your way in life if you moved to England or America. So there was a very strong sociological reason for abandoning Irish, if you hoped to make any progress in life. It was almost seen as a badge of disability to not to be able to speak English. And so that was one thing that was happening. As well as that, then, when the country started to progress and become financially and economically a bit more secure, nothing was done to help those poor communities. Socially and probably culturally, it was the Catholic people who were predominantly living in those areas. They had big families, so the small farm holdings couldn't support bigger families. Some of the young ones had to move away, if not many of them had to move away. So it was only kind of towards the end of the 50s and the 60s that the government began to realise that if they didn't do something to stop this hemorrhage, that these Gaeltacht areas would just simply waste away. So the government of the time decided to invest financially in those areas by making government grants available to small indigenous industries. There were things happening in those areas. For example, in North Donegal, Northwest Donegal, there's a very strong knitting tradition. You know, the Aran jump or Aran knitwear kind of tradition. That was a native thing that women did. Women knitted as a means of providing some kind of extra support for themselves. So those industries like that were encouraged with small grants. Then the Gaeltacht learning, the Irish language learning schemes of young students who were in school and who wanted to go to native areas, that those schemes, the Skeim Lauert and the Gaeilge, which is the Irish language speaking scheme, these schemes were augmented and supported more fulsomely with government money. Then in the 60s particularly, the government identified technological advances and thought, well, we could harness young people in these areas. If we give them a reason to stay, they will stay. They will marry other young people from the area, and so they'll have children in turn. Those children will be taught the language, and so this will be a way of helping the Gaeltacht areas to survive. And all of that happened. But I think really most commentators would nowadays recognise that it was too little, much too late. And it would have been a very beneficial thing for that to have happened 20 or 30 years earlier. But the government and the country at the time simply didn't have the financial wherewithal to do that. That brings you into the 70s and 80s, and we know what, even in the last 10 years alone, 10, 11, 12 years alone, the explosion that there's been in technological advances in communications. The mobile phone is almost as ubiquitous now as the internet, all of those things. And a strange thing about those developments is that they have both helped and hindered the progress or survival of the language. They've hindered it in a sense that the English language, which is such a powerful world language, has become even more powerful and penetrates almost every aspect of daily life, even in the Gaeltacht areas, because you've got the television, you've got internet now, you've mobile phones, all kinds of communications, you've got video recording machines, CDs, all of these things that can be used to look at documentaries, films, engage with the wider world, and it's all through the medium of English. And yet, that very sort of means of cultural erosion has also proved an advantage to the Irish language, because particularly in the boom Celtic Tiger years, money was made available by government to develop technological materials to help the language learners improve their skills. And the internet has made a global village of the Irish language community. So there are people in America who are learning, Native American people who are learning Irish, and they're doing it over the internet. And because of podcasts and live streaming and all this kind of technological advance, that they're able to engage with the language in a way that was never possible before for people living outside the island. It also means that people can communicate through the written style, typed in email, and it also means that they can access language learning lessons at any time of the day or night, anywhere in the world, if you have access to the World Wide Net, the World Wide Web. So those things have been positives, but the influence of English is all pervasive, and that's a big problem. And when you hear the Germans and the French worrying about intrusions and borrowings from the English language into aspects of particularly technological language in their countries, you can say, well, what hope is Irish when it's such a small language comparison even to German or French?
Yeah, that actually triggers another question. What happens when there's say a new technological development and you need a new word to describe something in Irish? I know in France there is a particular process. What happens? Is there an Irish term for email or mobile phone, and is there a process behind that?
Okay, well, we'll answer this, the first question with the term. What's the term for a mobile phone? The one that's most commonly used by Irish language speakers is phone polka or guhan polka. That means literally a phone of your pocket, or so it's a pocket phone. I know that even within English people call it different things. It's commonly called a mobile phone here in England and Ireland, but it's generally referred to as a cell phone in the States, I think. What was the second word you mentioned there?
Is there a process for saying this is now the Irish term for whatever?
Yeah, well, there's a committee called Ancuiste Chearmíochta, which means the terminology committee. And it was founded or came into being not in its current form, but a body similar to it came into existence roughly from about 1927 onwards, when the government realised that even with the advent of the car and even factories and this kind of machinery, farming machinery particularly, that we needed words for mowing machine or tractor or these kind of things. So they would put together teams of experts, usually people who were well-educated native speakers, other people who were professors in third-level institutions and who would have a particular expertise in scientific terminology or industrial terminology or cultural terminology, literary terminology, that kind of thing. And that was happening on an ad hoc basis until about 1968, when the government established an Buan Chuist Termólaíochta, which is the terminology committee, or the standing committee for terminology in Irish. And they put it on a proper footing, proper parliamentary footing. And that body was assigned as a branch of the Department of Education. And people were drawn from all those different areas of life. Most of the people were drawn from the areas of third level expertise, or people who were professors or significant experts in each different sort of facet of the language. And you had scientists, you had people who were native speakers, people who had specialised in the compilation of dictionaries and that kind of thing. They were all put together. And that remained the case up until about 1999, when that body was taken out from under the auspices of the Department of Education and Science and put over to Forest na Gaeilge, which is the state-sponsored body which is responsible for the promotion of the Irish language at all levels in Irish society. It was simply a move from out of one government body to another. But that committee comprises, I think, 25 members are nominated by the Minister for Education. They're drawn from all aspects of, all facets of Irish life. 15 of those people are on a steering committee, which basically handles the day-to-day basis, the day-to-day applications for new words. People will be developing websites or things, or that ordinary members of the public will write to the Terminology Commission, ask them for a term in Irish for a clutch in a car, or a chat room, or speed dating, or whatever it is. And this committee meets on the first Monday of every month and reviews the terminology, the applications that have come in. They divide the work out into subcommittees, so there will be people with an expertise in terms to do with literary criticism and that kind of area. There'll be people who will be dealing with computer and technological terminology, people dealing with scientific terminology, that kind of thing. So they go off, they work together, they look at what possibilities exist within the language as it stands, and they come up with the terminology. And to give you a good example, the word for a computer, people will think, well, God, you couldn't possibly have a native word in Irish for a computer. But the term they actually came up with is rivere. And rivere is developed from an ancient verb. It's a very, very old verb in the Irish language, riv, which means to calculate or to compute. And the suffix A-I-R-E or I-R-E in many words in Irish indicates like a sort of a doer. So literally a calculator or a computer. So rivere means a computer. And then sometimes they can't use, there aren't the basic building blocks of new terms within the native language, and so terms have to be coined, in which case they look, for example, at Latin or Greek roots. People sometimes complain, for instance, about the word, say, telephone, which is a native word, which is a word for the telephone, T-E-I-L-E-A-F-O for the N-F-O accent, telephone. People say, well, that's a makey-up word. And the thing about that is, they say, well, it's a borrowing from English, and there are people within the Irish language camp who are purists, linguistic purists, and see this as almost some kind of linguistic betrayal, that for years the English were here and drove the language out of us, and now we're turning around and compounding that betrayal by taking in words from English. But my attitude to that is that these aren't English words, these are originally from Latin or Greek roots, and that they're internationally used terms. Sometimes then terms can easily be found within the native corpus of words, and that so that a newly coined term like telephone can coexist with a more native term guhan, which comes from the word guh, which is your voice, and the father, the accent N suffix again generally indicates something that performs that action. So guhan is a voice thing, literally, i.e. a telephone. So the terms are adopted in. Sometimes the terms are accepted by the Irish language community. Sometimes they're seen to be a little bit foreign or not comfortable terms, so they're not used. And they sort of die off. But they're there in dictionaries, but the terms are there. The Terminology Committee also produces, when it has a sufficient body of terminology relating to one particular aspect of the language, they will publish that as a dictionary in hard copy. So for instance, over the years, let's say there was a dictionary of scientific terminology produced in 1966, and then a revised and updated version in 1994. Physiology and hygiene appeared in 1981. First composite term, computer terms appeared in 1990, and then was updated again more recently. 2007, the Dictionary of Literature and Criticism, so all terminology to do with like genre and film, cinema, all these kind of terms that are used in the literary world, literary criticism, they all are comprised. And going back to the advantages of technology, these terms are published